Hi, this is Ryan Thomas with EastWest. I'm a full-time composer for film and television, and today I'll be taking you through a longer-form tutorial based on the first demo I wrote for the 1 Minute ComposerCloud Tips series that we've been releasing over the past few months. We will be releasing expanded tutorials based on each one of these tips, so definitely stay tuned for those. I'll go ahead and start with what we will and will not be covering in these videos. We will be covering the orchestration and MIDI programming techniques that were used to produce these demos, but we probably won't be talking as much about the mixing process. And that's really just because if you've mastered orchestration and MIDI programming, these instruments don't really require extensive processing in order to get professional results. I'm also not going to be showing you every instrument that I'm using in this session because that information has already been provided to you. If you check in the description of this video, you should find a link that will take you to a list of every patch that I'm using in this session. So I would highly encourage you to go ahead and have that patch list open so that you can be referring to those as we're talking about the various instruments. So I'm going to go ahead and start at the very beginning. I'm just going to talk about each section as it comes in. The very first element we have here is the Alpenhorn from Raw. And there's really not much to talk about here. I've just copy and pasted the same note through the whole piece. But I have included a lift here in the pitch wheel, just to kind of give it that cool war horn effect. And I'll go ahead and remove that just so you can hear what it sounds like without it. And you can see it really loses quite a bit there, so you definitely need to have that pitch bend to achieve this particular effect. So let's go ahead and move on. That hit is from the Dynasty Daiko in Storm Drum 2. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about what our percussion is doing. So we have introduced the percussion using one of the rumps from Storm Drum 2, and that's a really cool patch that has all these great transitional elements that you can use to introduce a section or to transition from one part of a piece to another. And here we are using it to introduce our percussion, which in this case consists of the Earthquake patch from Storm Drum 2, as well as the Lord of Toms patch from Storm Drum 3. And let's go ahead and listen to those in isolation. Now, if you've noticed, I have opted to keep the velocities pretty light throughout the entire piece, and that's because with the bigger epic drums, you tend to get a much broader frequency response on the lower velocity hits. So I definitely needed that in particular for this piece. So let's take it from where the percussion comes in. This is just a cymbal scratch from Symphonic Orchestra. Okay, here we are introducing the ostinato string line in the celli and the basses. And let's go ahead and hear what they sound like in isolation. Now, if you notice, this particular line is not copied into the basses. And that's just because that much movement in the lower frequencies can tend to produce some muddiness that is not desirable in this context. So I've opted to just have the basses on these first three notes. Now, doubling the celli, we have the bassoon. And with the celli. Now, this is a very common doubling that you'll see in orchestration, and all the bassoon is doing is sort of adding this nice texture, this interesting color, and it's bringing out the line just a little bit more. So moving on from there. Okay, here we have introduced the snare, as well as the Dynasty Daiko. And the snare is going to give us some of that high-end energy in the percussion section, and the Dynasty Daiko is just going to round out the bottom with some of those big, boomy, lower frequencies. Let's go ahead and hear what they sound like together. And with all the percussion. I should point out that I'm not using the Dynasty Daiko through the entirety of the piece. I only have it in this section here because in the sort of final act, when the orchestra comes in, it gets to be a bit much. The mix becomes a little bit cluttered because this Dynasty Daiko, it takes up so much of the mix, and it is really great for sparse areas of a piece like the area that we're in now, but it's not the best when you have the whole orchestra going all at once. So let's go ahead and move on from here. Okay, so here we have a French horn bend that's actually just a pre-recorded phrase from symphonic orchestra. That's a really useful patch. And now let's go ahead and talk about this little call and response between the trumpets and the woodwinds that are also doubled with the violins. So let's start with the trumpets. And all I've done here is just switched between a staccato muted patch and a sustain muted patch. And I've also programmed in something of a forte piano effect in the sustain patch here. And that sounds like this. I could have used the actual accent patch in Hollywood Brass, but for this section it was just a little bit much. So I went ahead and just programmed that in by hand. Now let's look at what the woodwinds are doing. And you can see where I am switching between the articulations using the key switches. These notes trigger the shorts, and these ones trigger the trills. And I'm doing the same thing in the violins, except rather than using a key switch patch, again, I'm just alternating between a short and a trill patch. In this case, it's actually the violin key switch where I have triggered the whole tone trill. So let's go ahead and hear this again in context. Okay, there's a lot to talk about here, and let's go ahead and start in the strings. Okay, so we have added an ostinato string line in the violins and violas. Again, we're keeping the velocities fairly light, but I am adding a bit of an accent on beats 1 and beats 3. And I've also opted to include some violin runs just to give this section a little bit more urgency, a little bit more energy. And those runs sound like this. Now, if you notice, I have programmed in a bit of an accent at the beginning of each run. And that's just to emulate what a live string section would be doing if it was playing this. Now, along with the strings, I have also just copy and pasted this MIDI information down into the piccolo, flute, and clarinet runs patches. And so all together, that sounds like this. Now with our violins and viola shorts. So you can hear how those work together to create a nice energy. And let's go ahead and look at what's happening in the brass. Okay, so here our entrance is a staggered entrance going from the French horn to the low brass, just to give this cool 1-2 punch effect. And I've also layered that low brass entrance with a timpani hit, and that sounds like this. And you can hear how much more power that low brass entrance has with the timpani there to back it up. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll unsolo the timpani. Now again, to achieve this articulation, I'm just switching between a short patch, and in this case, the legato patches in the French horns, trombones, and tuba. And in the trumpets, I'm doing this just with a key switch patch. And you can see here where I am triggering the 2 different articulations. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about the reverb setup, because we had so many questions about that in the comments on the 1-minute videos. I send to my reverbs from the various section buses. So for strings, I am using the South California Hall Impulse from EastWest Spaces 2. And it's set to 100% wet because, again, we are using this as a send rather than as an insert. And the pre-delay is set to 26 milliseconds. For brass, I'm using the exact same room, but I'm using the brass-specific impulse for this. Again, set 100% wet, pre-delay of 22 milliseconds. For both my woodwinds and percussion, I am using the Northwest Hall, again set to 100% wet, pre-delay of 30.5 milliseconds. And finally, for the Alpenhorn, we are using the Abandoned Abbey with a pre-delay of 30.4 milliseconds. Okay, so now you're probably asking, well, what about bus 14? Bus 14 is just a really nice lexicon emulation in Spaces 2, and I send to this reverb for a couple reasons. The first one is to sort of glue everything together and make it sound like it's in the same space. And the second reason is to introduce some randomness to the reverb tails. All convolution reverb impulse responses will give you the exact same tail on every note. And a lot of mix engineers think that it can start to sound a little bit sterile, so they will also send to an algorithmic reverb like this. And algorithmic reverbs will always give you a truly random reverb tail on every note. Okay, well, I think that pretty much covers everything. If you have any questions that aren't already addressed in the video, feel free to leave those in the comment section, and I'll try to get to those as soon as I can. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.